Today we are visiting the Melbourne General Cemetery in Parkville in Melbourne to see the final resting place of an Irish convict transported to Australia in 1830. Her name was Ellen Scott. Scott was born in Limerick in Ireland in 1812. She was convicted at the Middlesex jail delivery on the 11th of June 1829 for stealing a watch chain from a Richard Dines, essentially pickpocketing. She was 16 years old. Her sentence was transportation for life, a very harsh punishment. I wonder if her Irish heritage played a part in the severity of the sentence. Ellen had only one previous conviction for vagrancy, for which she received a 1-month prison term. Ellen was a servant, and her father, James Scott, was a soldier in the 8th King's Regiment of Foot in Westminster, so maybe he even guarded the royal family. She also had 2 brothers in the army, so I find it interesting that she did resort to pickpocketing. Was she doing it for just a bit of fun? Was she bored, or was she in need? I don't know. We are fortunate that some of Ellen's story has been researched by Trudy Cowley and included in the book Convict Lives, Women at the Cascades Female Factory, published by the Convict Women's Press at the Female Convicts Research Centre in Hobart, Tasmania. Ellen's story is on page 66 and goes until 69, under the headline Ellen Scott of the Flash Mob. Now, Ellen arrived in Van Diemen's Land in February of 1830 on the Eliza I, and Cowley writes, along with her 115 surviving shipmates, she was marched from Sullivan's Cove to the Cascades Female Factory to await assignment. Ellen was 18 when she arrived in Tasmania, and here is her convict description. And she is described as pale, her head was round, her visage was round, her hair was brown, and her eyes were light brown. And she had some initials tattooed above her elbow joint on her right arm, and it looks like it might be a TJ or an FJ and a BN and a JL, and I'm not sure if they were friends or family. But many convicts, including females, did have tattoos, and especially tattoos of the initials of their loved ones. And so I've put Ellen's description into ChatGPT, and this is the image it has given me, and I just love this image. And as you can see, so this is when Ellen was 18, when she would have arrived in Van Diemen's Land, and around her neck she's wearing an iron collar, and you'll learn later on why I have included that. But I just think this is a really powerful image of what Ellen may have looked like. And I also asked the ChatGPT to give me an image of Ellen at 50 and what she may have looked like after a tough life in the female factories of Tasmania and then on the Goldfields in Victoria. And this is the image it's given me. Again, another powerful image. Right from the start, Ellen was fiery. Her convict record is filled, as you can see, with misdemeanors, 48 in total. She was not happy about being assigned as slave labour, and who could blame her? She faced harsh punishment from the beginning. Her first assignment was to a Mr. Watchhorn, And within weeks she was charged with being out of bed at an unreasonable hour on a Sunday and disobeying orders. Ellen was confined to a cell for 7 days in C class at the Female House of Correction, known as the Female Factory, and given only bread and water as punishment. And E. Crawford from the Female Convicts Research Centre writes, the class system classified and segregated convict women based on their behaviour. It was simultaneously a system of reward and punishment, and it was also a method of keeping incorrigible females separate from those who were well behaved and capable of reform. C class was crime class, and the lowest of the classes. The rules and regulations for the management of the House of Correction describe the distinctive marks on the uniform worn by crime class women and the tasks they were expected to perform. Third-class convicts wore a uniform with a large yellow C in the centre of the back of the jacket, one on the right sleeve and another on the back part of the petticoat. The third class was employed in washing for the establishment, for the orphan schools and the penitentiary, in carding wool, spinning or in such other manner as directed by the principal superintendent. And on Ellen's record it indicates she was working at the hospital, so she may have been washing sheets and other items from the hospital. Now remember, Ellen had only just arrived in the colony and this was her first misdemeanour, yet she was already being treated like the worst of the worst. 2 days into Ellen's sentence, she was again charged by Mr. Watchorn for stealing 1 sovereign and other monies, the property of a James Boone. Now it's unclear how Ellen could have done this from her jail cell. Perhaps the stolen items were discovered later, or Ellen was a convenient scapegoat for someone else's crime. Who knows? Regardless, the charge was dismissed, but it was recommended that Ellen remain in the Female Factory's crime class for a further 3 months. Fiona Stocker writes in a moving article titled A Far Cry that it's hard to imagine why the authorities in the colonies were so cruel, but we are told that the women passing through the factory were seen as being in need of reform. Ellen and women like her were often accused of being notorious, savage and delinquent, and they were referred to as dangerous strumpets. A strumpet is an adulteress, a hussy or a trollop. Don't you just love the many and varied words created to describe women? As a female convict, she was considered guilty just for existing, and her Irish heritage would have done her no favours in colonial Australia. After she served her sentence, Ellen was assigned to Peter Lett of Launceston. Ellen was assigned to the Letts for a total of 6 months, but she spent most of that time at the Georgetown Female Factory for a number of misdemeanours. Her crimes consisted of neglect of duty and disobedience of orders. She got 10 days solitary confinement for that, on bread and water. 2 instances of refusing to work, both punished with 10 days in solitary confinement. And her final 2 acts of refusing to work resulted in a 2 3-month sentence at the Georgetown factory, or 2 3-month sentences, where she would have been given hard labour. Perhaps she preferred that to being assigned as a domestic slave to strangers. Now, I must admit, as I was walking around the Melbourne General Cemetery, just how shocked I was at the state of disrepair many of the graves are, especially of the old pioneers of Melbourne and Victoria. You would think that, the city would want to maintain its history, but apparently not. Many of the new graves are, of course, all looking amazing, but these old sections, terrible. I don't know what's happening or why, but I have to admit I was shocked. So in September of 1821, Ellen was assigned to a Mr. Nan, but it was rocky from the start. As usual. She was quickly charged with being drunk and absent without leave and was promptly sent back to the factory at Georgetown for a further 2 months of hard labour. After finishing her punishment, Ellen was again assigned to Mr. Peter Lett, but this time she refused to go and was given 15 days in solitary confinement on bread and water. A year later, Ellen was assigned to the Cook family, where she promptly absconded and remained at large for 7 days before being apprehended and given 3 months in crime class at the Cascades Female Factory in Hobart. So they've shipped her back to Hobart. Trudy Cowley was right when she wrote, Ellen was obviously someone who disliked being in service, being forced to work as a domestic drudge, and someone with a lively and willful nature. After her 3 months, she was assigned to a Mr. Graham, and the day after arriving at the Grahams, she was found missing from her service and was returned to crime class at the female factory. I don't know about you, but I kind of like Ellen's rebellious spirit. Why should she be forced to work as slave labour? And all for the crime of stealing a watch chain. Hardly a hangable offence. Well, maybe in 1830s. Britain it was. There was just so much unnecessary grief and hardship for these female convicts. 6 months later, Ellen was assigned to R. Kerr, but she was soon returned to the factory after burning her arm. A month later, she was assigned to a Mr. Dwyer, but the service was found to be improper. And Trudy Cowley writes, an improper service could mean that Ellen was not kept under control by her master or mistress, or possibly that she was working as a prostitute while in service. From here on in, it gets even grimmer. By January of 1833, Ellen had been assigned to Mr. Atkinson, I'm not sure how to say that. She was accused of causing a violent illness to an infant child, endangering its life through willful and wicked neglect and absconding. It's hard to understand why anyone would want to entrust their children to someone who clearly didn't want to be there, but who knows what the real story was. Ellen suffered greatly for this event. Her sentence included 6 months in the crime class at the female factory, solitary confinement, a diet of bread and water for the maximum duration of 28 days, and she had to wear an iron collar. The Female Convicts Research Centre states that the punishment handed down by the Van Diemen's Land magistrate merely states that a female convict was to wear the iron collar for a period of 7 days, 14 days, or 28 days, and up to a maximum of 1 month. Lieutenant Colonel, Cimetiere, no idea, commander at Georgetown in 1820, described the iron collar as a badge of infamy and disgrace, and this collar being the usual instrument throughout the colonies, which is put around the neck of women of infamous character. So it's likely that Ellen probably wore the collar for at least a month. There were several versions of the iron collar used for the punishment of female convicts in Van Diemen's Land between 1815 and 1834. The iron collar was a cast iron neck collar, possibly hinged at the sides and either locked into place or riveted into place by a blacksmith. James Boyce, in his book Van Diemen's Land, described the iron collar as a large band of iron placed around the neck, which was occasionally, if illegally, used. The collar weight varied depending on its design. However, it was reported in the 1820 Magistrate's Inquiry into the punishment of Alice Robson that the collar used in her punishment weighed 6¼ pounds, so it is likely Ellen wore the same type of collar. From June to July 1833, Ellen had 3 more assignments, to a Mr. Solomon, a Mr. Watson and a Mr. Lample, and consequently she received 3 separate convictions for being absent without leave and out after hours. These offences led to 3 more internments in the cells and solitary confinement at the factory. Was the punishment Ellen received reforming her, or was it causing her to become even more hardened and prone to misbehaviour? You be the judge. In October, an incident occurred that has become infamous in the folklore surrounding the female convicts of Tasmania. And as you can imagine by now, Ellen was right in the heart of the scandal. The flash mob and the myth of the flashing bottoms at the female factory. Lucy Frost has written a great piece about what was happening at the factory during Ellen's time there, published on the Female Convicts Research Centre website. And Lucy writes, in the Cascades Female Factory, a group of women developed a distinctive subculture, defying the convict system's program for reform. The labour regime at the core of the assignment system was predicated upon a work model in which women were assigned to work for settlers in return for stipulated clothes, food and lodgings. Members of the flash mob refused the model. They were not going to serve the settlers. They had absolutely no interest in performing the role of domestic servant. Whenever they were sent on assignment to some unsuspecting master, they resisted in the way servants could by refusing to work, spoiling their work, insolence, talking back, getting drunk, etc. The master would then charge his recalcitrant think that's how you say that, servant with a breach of discipline. A magistrate would sentence her to X number of days or weeks in the female factory, and she would return to the turf ruled by her friends in the crime class. This network of women was known to the public as the flash mob, with flash referring to their clothes and their general sense of style, using flash in the sense of flash cars and having nothing at all to do with crudely exposing bottoms. Their flash dress was a fashion statement, marking them out as special. Amidst the women of the crime class, condemned to drab prison garb, the flash mob sported brightly coloured silk handkerchiefs and embroidered caps, wore rings in their ears and on their hands, and carried on a thriving trade in fancy buttons. The general public in Hobart were made aware of this prison subculture through newspaper speculation. One of the magistrates who visited the Cascades female factory to hear charges told the Colonial Times in 1840 that a flash mob was in existence, but through fear, intimidation, and a kind of Masonic and secret influence, it was not possible to discover the same. This did not stop the newspaper from speculating, however, and the name they named was Alan Scott. Lucy goes on to write about the incident with the Reverend. The most famous story about the Cascades female factory is a tale of flashing bottoms. On a day when the colonial chaplain Reverend William Bedford was preaching to 300 convict women, while Lieutenant Governor Sir John Franklin and his wife Jane looked on, the incarcerated audience showed their mocking displeasure by suddenly turning around, all at the same time, pulling up their skirts and smacking their bare bottoms. This story has been told by historians for more than 60 years and is the subject of a widely circulated postcard, which you can see on screen now. But Lucy Frost writes, this piece of history is a myth. Its creator was an Irishman named Robert Crook, who immigrated to Van Diemen's Land in 1840, hoping to be appointed colonial chaplain. Instead, he found himself in the low-status job of catechist working for the convict department at a probation station on the Tasman Peninsula. I find it interesting that the incident is considered a myth because Alan's records show something did occur during the Reverend's visit. On the 3rd of October, Alan was charged with indecent behaviour during the performance of divine service by the Reverend William Bedford, Jr. at the Female House of Correction. Her punishment was 2 months added to her present sentence, with 1 month to be spent in solitary confinement. So what did happen? It may not have been a flash mob, but Alan was certainly involved in something. In 1834, Alan continued her rebellious behaviour during her assignments. She was assigned to 4 different families, and each time she absconded and she was sent back to the factory, or put on wash tub duties for a month. She was even returned from the Mackenzie household after being found dancing in a pub late one night. From 1835 through to 1843, Alan's life continued in much the same way, and I actually started to feel really stressed just reading about what her life had become. I've counted 19 different families that Alan was assigned to, and each ended with her being sent back to the factory. Her crimes included being absent without leave, absconding, insolence, neglect, leaving without permission, drunkenness, disobedience, insubordination, being out after hours, misconduct, gross misconduct. It's a long list. Her time at the factory during those years was also tough. She was put into solitary confinement and on bread and water for 10 days for insolent and abusive language to Mr. Hutchinson. Now, Mr. Hutchinson was the Reverend John Hutchinson, a former Methodist missionary who became superintendent of the female factory along with his wife Mary. And they've actually got a really interesting story, which I'd also love to do a video on. They were heavily involved in the orphan schools in Parramatta with the Reverend Samuel Marsden. So they're a real part of Australian history. Anyway, a year and a half later, Alan was charged with violently assaulting Mr. Hutchinson with intent to kill or do him bodily harm. Trudy Cowley writes that several other female convicts were also involved in the riot, and they were all charged with insubordination for forcibly, violently, and turbulently resisting Mr. Hutchinson and openly refusing to obey his lawful commands. For that attack, Alan was taken to Hobart Jail and then to the Launceston Female Factory to serve 2 years of hard labour. It is likely these convicts were all members of the flash mob. They were involved in trafficking goods into the factories and were cited in the inquiry into female convict discipline as being involved in lesbian relationships. There were at least 6 major riots in the Cascades and Launceston factories between 1839 and 1844, with many of the same prisoners involved in more than one riot and in both locations. Allen's pattern of behaviour continued the same in Launceston. She was in and out of the female factory for offences while in assigned service. The charges were not brought by her master or mistress in all cases. In March of 1843, Allen was charged with misconduct for occupying the same room as her master. She was returned to the Crown for reassignment. Allen's final offence occurred in June of 1843 when she was charged with gross misconduct for introducing tobacco into the factory. She was given 6 months of hard labour for this and kept separate at the jail. Trudy Crowley writes that Allen Scott was still in the Launceston district in September of 1846, but no more is known about her after she received her conditional pardon in 1847. Well, I have found Ellen, and I found her resting place here at the Melbourne Cemetery. And here she is. Ellen has no gravestone and no marker for where she lies, but she is lying somewhere beneath this green grass. And it's quite a nice part of the cemetery considering so much of the old pioneer parts are just really in disrepair. So on the 31st of January 1844, Ellen received permission to marry fellow convict William Cochrane, and you can learn more about William in a previous video I have uploaded on the Convict Lives Australia YouTube channel. Now, it is unknown how the two met. William had received a conditional pardon, so he was free to work and roam about Launceston, and so the two likely met while Ellen was serving her sentence in the Launceston jail for introducing tobacco into the female factory. They were married a few months later on the 11th of March at St. John's Church by the Reverend William Henry Brown. Ellen received her conditional pardon in October of 1847, which meant she could leave Tasmania and travel to other parts of Australia. By 1853, the couple were living in Bendigo, having travelled there, no doubt, to join the hordes of other gold seekers from around the world searching for their fortunes. I can find no record of Ellen on the Goldfields, other than in the witness statement at the coroner's inquest of her husband William's death in 1865 by the Dr. Harry Lee Atkinson. And Dr. Harry spoke of remembering Ellen. He said, "I have known William Cochrane. I attended to his late wife when they lived near the Star and Garter Hotel in Mitchell Street." And Ellen's death certificate records that she never had any children, alive or dead. So Ellen must have suffered an illness while living in Bendigo, which is why she was attended to by Dr. Harry. In February of 1863, Ellen died at the Wesleyan Immigrants' Home in Melbourne of dysentery. She was 50 years old. It is not known why Ellen was in Melbourne at the time, but the Wesleyan Methodist Home offered shelter to newly arrived immigrants in Victoria. An advertisement in the Argus in December of 1852 offered lodgings and board to members of the society and other respectable persons who may require lodgings. I suspect Ellen had become ill and needed care, and I believe the answer to why she was at the immigrants' home or the Wesleyan Immigrants' Home in Melbourne was down to her relationship with a Reverend William Hill, and he was the reverend that oversaw her burial. Now, Reverend Hill was a Wesleyan minister and former missionary to India before coming to Victoria around 1854, and he worked in Melbourne, Castlemaine, Ballarat and Bendigo on the Goldfields before becoming superintendent of the Collingwood circuit. I suspect Alan and William knew Reverend William in Bendigo and may have even attended the Wesleyan Church in Bendigo, because a witness at William's inquest stated that William had been a pious Christian, and it would make sense that the couple would turn to the church in their time of need. And as I mentioned in my last video, William was buried in the Methodist section of the Bendigo Cemetery, and Alan, of course, is in the Wesleyan section of the cemetery here in Melbourne. Unfortunately, the immigrants' home has been demolished to make way for grander housing at 48 Drummond Street, Carlton, so I was unable to film any of it. But Alan Scott's life is a powerful testament to the harsh conditions endured by female convicts and their remarkable resilience. As a member of the flash mob at the Cascades Female Factory, Alan faced severe hardships, including strict discipline, hard labour and social isolation. Despite these challenges, Ellen displayed incredible resilience. She resisted the oppressive convict system through acts of defiance. Her story highlights the strength and determination of female convicts who, despite facing significant adversity, found ways to assert their identity and resist their circumstances. Ellen's life exemplifies the enduring spirit of these women and their ability to survive and adapt in the face of extreme hardship. Today she has been found and remembered.